Every wild chimpanzee alive right now is playing a game with steep odds. More than 90% of them will be dead before they turn 40. The small number who make it past that age keep having babies right up until the end, because in the wild, a chimpanzee's body is not built to survive long past its own fertility. Human bodies are different, radically different. A healthy woman today can expect to live 3 or 4 decades after her last child is born, and that stretch of life beyond fertility is not some modern accident produced by hospitals and vitamins. It shows up in fossils that are tens of thousands of years old. Somewhere in the last few 100,000 years, the human species crossed into something almost no other mammal gets to keep: a long, protected stretch of life after the body stops being useful for making more bodies. Nobody voted on this. No single ancestor sat down and decided it. The real question is who got that extra stretch of life first, what they had to be worth to earn it, and why evolution, which has no patience at all for waste, allowed it to happen in the first place. This did not happen everywhere, all at once, to every population of every hominin species that ever existed. For most of the time humans have walked this planet, growing old the way we think of it now was rare, an exception, not an expectation. Neanderthals lived alongside our own direct ancestors for tens of thousands of years, hunted the same animals, buried their dead, and cared for injured members of their own bands. And even they, by the best evidence available, rarely made it to what we would now call old age. And when the shift finally did happen for our own lineage, the fossil record shows it arriving less like a slow drift and more like a threshold being crossed all at once. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Most retellings of ancient human life lean on the brutal average: short, hard, over fast. That average is real, and it is not being softened here. But underneath that grim headline number sits a second, quieter pattern, a growing sliver of every generation that lived decades past its reproductive years, and a very specific set of evolutionary bargains that decided exactly who those people were. That pattern is written into fossilized teeth. It is written into gene variants still circulating in living human populations today. And strangely enough, it is written into the ocean, where a handful of whale species ran into the exact same evolutionary problem humans did, faced it with none of the same anatomy, and solved it in almost the same way. The easy explanation for why anyone gets old is that bodies simply wear out. Cells divide, errors accumulate, tissues fail, and eventually the machine stops running. That much is true, as far as it goes. It is also incomplete in a way that matters. If aging were purely the unavoidable cost of being made out of cells, every species would age at roughly the same rate, adjusted for size. They do not. In 2016, a team led by Julius Nielsen at the University of Copenhagen used radiocarbon dating on the eye lenses of 28 Greenland sharks and found a lifespan of at least 272 years, with the largest shark in the sample estimated at nearly 4 centuries old. A shark and a mouse are built from the same basic biological materials, the same cell membranes, the same mitochondria, the same handful of amino acids, and yet one of them is old news by year 3, while the other is still practically a teenager at year 150. Wear and tear alone cannot explain a gap that wide. Something else decides how fast a given body is allowed to fail, and that something is natural selection, which stops caring about your body the moment you are finished reproducing. It has already collected its payment by then. Whatever happens to you afterward is close to invisible to the process that built you in the first place. Which raises the real question hiding inside the easy explanation. If evolution stops caring what happens to a body once reproduction ends, why does it seem to have made a special exception for humans, keeping a huge share of every generation alive and functioning for decades past the point where their genes are already secured? That is where this stops being a simple biology lesson and starts being an evolutionary case file, one where the fossil evidence, the genetics, and a pod of orcas off the coast of Washington state all end up pointing toward the same answer. The first clue comes from working out why aging exists as a biological program at all, instead of assuming it explains itself. In 1952, the British immunologist Peter Medawar delivered a lecture at University College London titled An Unsolved Problem of Biology, and in it, he laid out something that sounds obvious once somebody says it, but had never been formally worked through before. Natural selection can only act on traits that affect an organism while it still has a realistic chance of being alive. A mutation that kills you at age 5 gets ruthlessly weeded out, because almost nobody carrying it survives long enough to pass it on. A mutation that kills you at age 70 is nearly invisible to selection, because in the ancestral environment, almost nobody was making it to 70 in the first place. There was nothing left for selection to eliminate. Medawar described this as the shrinking force of natural selection with age, and it means harmful mutations expressed late in life can pile up across generations, essentially free of consequence, simply because nobody was watching anymore. 5 years later, the American biologist George Williams pushed the idea further in a 1957 paper published in the journal Evolution. Williams noticed that some genes go further than simply being ignored in old age. They actively work against the organism later on, in exchange for a benefit earlier. He named this antagonistic pleiotropy, one gene doing two jobs, useful in youth and damaging in old age, and argued selection will favor that gene regardless, because the early benefit is the only part that gets counted. A gene variant that strengthens bone density and fertility at 25, but raises cancer risk at 65, is not a mistake evolution failed to catch. It is a trade evolution actively made, over and over, because the 25-year-old version of a person is the one doing the reproducing, and the 65-year-old version was never supposed to be around to collect the bill. Both ideas have held up remarkably well since. Later researchers found real-world fingerprints of exactly this pattern, genetic disorders like Huntington's disease that typically strike after the age of 40, well past the point where most ancestral humans would have already finished having children, letting the underlying mutation ride along in the population for generation after generation with almost no selective pressure against it. Put those two ideas side by side, and something uncomfortable falls out of them. Aging is not a malfunction. It functions closer to an accounting decision made by a process that only keeps its books open until the last child is raised. Every organism on Earth is, in some sense, built to become disposable the moment it finishes its reproductive job. Which means the real puzzle is not why humans age, because every animal does that. The puzzle is why humans, uniquely among primates, appear to have found a way to keep a large share of the population alive and functioning for decades after the books were technically closed. Somebody had to be worth the ongoing cost, and the clearest baseline for what happens when nobody makes that case comes from the animal most genetically similar to us on the planet. In December of 2007, the anthropologist Melissa Emery Thompson, then at Harvard University, published a study in the journal Current Biology, built on decades of field data collected across 6 wild chimpanzee populations, including long-term research sites made famous by Jane Goodall, who is listed as a co-author on the paper. The team analyzed 534 recorded chimpanzee births, alongside more than 3,400 years of female reproductive risk, and the picture that came out of it was stark. In the wild, more than 90% of female chimpanzees die before reaching age 40. Of the small number who survive past that point, nearly half gave birth again after 40, and some kept reproducing well into their 50s. Chimpanzee fertility does not switch off ahead of the body. It fails at almost exactly the same pace as everything else fails, because there was never enough of a population surviving that long for selection to build anything different. Compare that to human hunter-gatherer populations, where fertility drops sharply around age 40, but overall mortality stays relatively gentle for decades afterward. Emery Thompson's team found that human reproduction nearly stops at a point when human mortality is still low, while chimpanzee reproduction and chimpanzee mortality decline together, locked in step with each other. In the study's own language, Reproductive decline in chimpanzees looks like ordinary body aging. In humans, it looks like something else entirely, a distinct biological event that arrives on a schedule of its own, decades ahead of when the rest of the body finally gives out. Wild gorillas and orangutans show similar patterns to chimpanzees, brief windows of decline that track the rest of the body rather than a long, separate stop. Whatever produced the extended human afterlife past fertility, it did not come standard issue with being a great ape. It had to be built, piece, by something specific to our own lineage. A chimpanzee who beats the odds and lives to 50 is still trying to have another baby. A human who lives to 50 is, on average, only about halfway through her adult life, with an entire second act ahead of her that her closest living relative essentially does not get. There is no chimpanzee equivalent of a grandmother teaching a grandchild how to crack a particular nut with a particular stone, not because chimpanzees lack the intelligence for it, but because there are almost never enough surviving grandmothers around for that kind of long-term transmission to matter at a population level. The obvious next question is when that second act first appeared in our own lineage. Not in theory, in the ground. The fossil record answers the timing question, and the answer complicates the tidy version of this story, the one where humans just slowly and steadily got better at growing old over millions of years. In 2004, the anthropologists Rachel Kaspari of the University of Michigan and Sang-Hee Lee of the University of California, Riverside, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining more than 750 hominin teeth spanning roughly the last 3 million years of human evolution. The method was simple in concept and rigorous in execution. Teeth wear down at a predictable rate as an individual ages, so by measuring wear patterns across 4 successive groups, Australopithecines, early Homo, Neanderthals, and early modern humans from the Upper Paleolithic, the researchers could calculate what they called the OY ratio, the number of older, grandparent-aged adults compared to younger, newly reproductive-aged adults in each group's death record. The results showed a slow, genuine increase in that ratio across the earlier groups. Australopithecines came in at roughly 0.12. Early Homo more than doubled that figure. Neanderthals climbed a little higher still, to 0.39. Then, in the early modern humans of the Upper Paleolithic, dated to roughly 30,000 years ago, the ratio jumped to 2.08, more than 5 times the figure that came right before it. For the first time in the entire 3 million year record, there were more old adults dying than young ones. Kaspari and Lee checked whether this could be explained away by burial bias, older individuals simply receiving more careful burial while younger ones were discarded and lost to the record, and ruled it out. The pattern held. This is the part that breaks the comfortable version of the story. If growing old were simply a slow biological refinement, a little more longevity layered in with each passing 100,000 years, the jump from Neanderthals to modern humans should resemble the jump from Australopithecines to early Homo. Gradual, proportional, expected. It does not resemble that at all. Neanderthals, who overlapped with early modern humans in time, shared much of the same physiology and life history, and even interbred with them, show almost no improvement in adult survivorship over hominins that came 500,000 years earlier. Then, in what amounts to a geological eye blink, modern humans of the Upper Paleolithic doubled, and then more than doubled again, the number of people living long enough to see their own grandchildren. Something specific happened in that window, and it had nothing to do with slowly evolving a sturdier body, because Neanderthal bodies were, if anything, more heavily built and physically powerful than the modern humans who eventually outlasted them. Kaspari and Lee's own conclusion tied the shift to major cultural changes visible in the same period of the archaeological record: symbolic art, long-distance trade in raw materials, elaborate grave goods, and the first clear evidence of complex layered social organization. The people did not get tougher. Something about how they were living changed, and that change let a far larger fraction of every generation survive into old age. Kaspari has argued elsewhere that this surge in older adults is a plausible driver behind the very cultural explosion it is correlated with. since a population carrying more grandparents also carries more accumulated technical knowledge, more storytellers, and more spare hands to help raise the next round of children while their parents hunt or gather. Longevity and culture, on this account, did not simply happen at the same time by coincidence. They likely built each other. The question left standing is what, specifically, made keeping old people alive suddenly worth the cost. Modern hunter-gatherer societies, an imperfect proxy for the deep past, but still the closest living window we have into it, show exactly what changed. In 2007, the anthropologists Michael Gervin of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Hillard Kaplan of the University of New Mexico published a cross-cultural analysis in the journal Population and Development Review, pulling together mortality data from foraging and small-scale societies around the world, including the Hadza of Tanzania, the Aceh of Paraguay, and the Ju-Hoansi of the Kalahari. Their conclusion directly contradicted the old assumption that prehistoric life was uniformly nasty, brutish, and short. Once a person survived the dangerous early years of childhood, hunter-gatherer adults had a modal lifespan, the single most common age at death, somewhere between 68 and 78 years. That is a real, adaptive human lifespan, not a fluke of modern medicine, and it lines up closely with the kind of survivorship the fossil record shows becoming common around 30,000 years ago. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The reason those extra decades were worth protecting comes down to a simple, almost accounting-level fact about food. The University of Utah anthropologist Kristen Hawkes spent years studying the Hadza and documented that older women, past their own reproductive years, often gathered more food, particularly deeply buried tubers that require real strength and skill to extract, than younger women who were busy nursing infants and could not range as far from camp. Those older women were not dead weight being carried along by the group. They were feeding it, specifically feeding their own grandchildren, freeing their daughters to have more children sooner because someone else was reliably supplying calories. An elder inside that system was not a mouth to feed. She was a food source with decades of accumulated knowledge about where the food actually was, which watering holes ran dry in which seasons, which plants were poisonous, and which only looked that way at a glance. That knowledge does not exist without a body old enough to have collected it, and a group willing to keep that body alive long enough to use it. The same logic applies to older men in many of these societies, whose value shifted from raw hunting output toward tool production, arbitration of disputes, and detailed knowledge of terrain and animal behavior built up across decades in the same landscape. The kind of expertise a 20-year-old hunter, however strong, simply has not had time to acquire yet. A hominin population that tolerates, feeds, and protects its older members turns those individuals from a cost into an engine, one that produces more surviving grandchildren per generation than a population that lets everyone past 50 simply fend for themselves. Once that engine exists, the individuals genetically inclined to survive into old age, and the groups culturally inclined to keep them around, will out-reproduce everyone else over time. That is not sentiment. That is math, running in the background across tens of thousands of years, until it finally surfaces as a five-fold jump inside a set of fossilized teeth. There is one piece of this whole system so strange it barely makes sense on paper, and it is not found only in humans. Classic evolutionary theory predicts menopause should not exist at all. If natural selection rewards reproduction above almost everything else, an organism that stops reproducing decades before it actually dies should be an evolutionary dead end, its lineage steadily outcompeted by any variant willing to keep having offspring until the body itself finally fails. And yet human women routinely live 30 years past their last possible pregnancy, and this cannot be explained away as a side effect of modern medicine, since the same pattern shows up clearly in hunter-gatherer mortality data collected from populations with no access to it. Almost no other mammal on Earth does this. The two clearest exceptions are not primates at all, they are toothed whales. In 2015, a team led by Lauren Brent and Daniel Franks, working alongside Emma Foster, Kenneth Balcom of the Center for Whale Research, and Michael Kant and Darren Croft of the University of Exeter, published a study in Current Biology on southern resident killer whales, a population off the coast of Washington state that has been tracked individually, animal by animal, for more than 40 years by Balcom's team. They found that post-reproductive female orcas, grandmothers who had stopped calving, consistently led their pods to salmon foraging grounds, functioning as what the researchers called repositories of ecological knowledge. That leadership became far more important in years when salmon were scarce, exactly when one wrong decision about where to hunt could threaten the survival of the entire group. A related analysis of the same long-term dataset, tracking the survival of 378 calves, found that a calf's risk of death rose sharply after its own grandmother died, especially during lean salmon years, and especially for male calves, since sons mate outside their birth pod and do not compete with their mother's group for resources the way daughters eventually do. Then, in 2017, Darren Croft and Rufus Johnstone of the University of Cambridge, along with several of the same co-authors, published a follow-up study in Current Biology, adding a second, darker layer to the picture. Orca mothers and their adult daughters sometimes breed in the same years, and when they do, the older mother's calves die at dramatically higher rates than her daughter's calves do. The researchers proposed that menopause in killer whales evolved partly as a retreat from that competition. Rather than fight her own daughter for limited resources in a contest she is biologically likely to lose, an aging female orca's best genetic strategy becomes stepping back from reproduction entirely and redirecting all of that effort toward keeping her daughter's and son's offspring alive instead. Her genes still move forward. They simply travel through grandchildren rather than through new children of her own. Killer whales and short-finned pilot whales are the clearest confirmed cases sharing this pattern, with more recent research pointing to similar post-reproductive lifespans in belugas and narwhals as well, all of them toothed whales living in tight, multi-generational family groups, not unlike the small bands early humans lived in. All of it evolved completely independently, in an ocean environment with almost nothing in common with the plains and forests where human evolution unfolded. When two unrelated lineages solve the exact same seemingly impossible problem in almost the exact same way, arriving at an extended functional stretch of life after fertility ends, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a real, recurring solution to a real, recurring pressure. In certain species, knowledge and food matter more than one additional pregnancy. That same underlying trade, effort spent on the self versus effort spent on the next generation, is still visible in human genetics today, sitting inside the DNA of the people who live the longest among us. In 2008, Bradley Wilcox and colleagues at the Kuakini Medical Center's Honolulu Heart Program, building on decades of research into centenarians of Japanese ancestry, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences identifying a gene called FOXO3, strongly and repeatedly associated with human longevity, first documented in elderly American men of Japanese descent, and later confirmed across more than a dozen independent studies in different populations worldwide. FOXO3 helps regulate how cells respond to stress and manage energy, effectively controlling whether a cell spends its resources on rapid growth or on long-term maintenance and repair. The version of the gene associated with living past 100 appears to shift that balance toward maintenance, in exactly the kind of trade Williams described back in 1957, except this time, the trade seems to run in the carrier's favor rather than against them. A separate line of evidence comes from the Longevity Genes Project, run since 1998 by Nir Barzilai at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. Barzilai's team has studied more than 500 Ashkenazi Jewish centenarians between the ages of 95 and 112, along with their children, specifically because that population's relatively uniform genetic background makes it easier to isolate the variants responsible. The team identified gene variants affecting lipoprotein processing and cholesterol transport that appear repeatedly in centenarians and their offspring, protecting against heart disease and, in some cases, cognitive decline, decades before those conditions would normally set in. The striking part is what Barzilai found when he compared centenarian habits to the general population. Many of the longest-lived people in his study smoked, drank, ate poorly, and rarely exercised, and lived past 100 anyway. Their advantage was not behavior, it was inheritance, passed down through families for generations, without anyone in those families necessarily knowing why some of them kept outliving their neighbors. It is the same kind of inherited advantage that led a modern human population 30,000 years ago, and then a pod of killer whales facing an entirely different set of problems in an entirely different ocean, tip the balance of who gets to survive long after their most obvious biological job is finished. None of these genes exist because evolution has any particular fondness for old age on its own terms. They persist because, generation after generation, in specific circumstances, an old body turned out to be more valuable alive than it was expensive to keep. Put the whole record side by side, and one fact stands above the rest. For most of the 3 million years covered in Kaspari and Lee's fossil analysis, hominin life ended, on average, right around the point where it stopped being reproductively useful. The same unforgiving deal every wild chimpanzee still lives under today. Then, in a window that barely registers on a geological clock, one population broke that deal by more than 5-fold, and never went back. Nobody chose any single person to be the one who got to grow old. There was no ceremony, no vote, no moment where a specific ancestor was selected to receive an extra 30 years of life. What happened instead was slower and colder than that. Certain individuals, and certain groups willing to protect and feed those individuals, produced more surviving grandchildren than everyone around them. That advantage compounded, generation after generation, until an entire species carried genes and built cultures organized around the quiet assumption that some of its members would keep living, keep working, and keep knowing things long after their bodies stopped being able to reproduce. The tubers the Hadza grandmothers dug up, the salmon runs the orca grandmothers still remember, the gene variants sitting patiently inside Ashkenazi and Okinawan centenarians right now, all of it traces back to the same cold evolutionary logic. An old body earns its keep by knowing something a young one has not had time to learn yet. Every one of the last 3 million years is stacked against this outcome. Almost nothing that has ever lived gets to keep existing once its usefulness to its own reproduction has run out. And for the overwhelming majority of hominin history, humans were no exception to that rule either. The teeth in Kaspari and Lee's samples say so plainly enough. Generation after generation of individuals who, like every wild chimpanzee alive today, simply stopped showing up in the fossil record once their childbearing years ended. Then, something in the way a small number of bands organized themselves, fed each other, and passed down what they knew, tipped that balance somewhere around 30,000 years ago, and never let it tip back. You did not choose your own capacity to grow old, any more than a Neanderthal chose not to have it. It was decided, slowly and without ceremony, by every ancestor whose survival past 40 made the difference between a grandchild who lived and one who did not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.